Our leaders of the world's richest democracies have agreed to stiffen sanctions against Russia in a renewed bid to starve Moscow's war machine. That pledge made clear during the G7 summit, a three-day meeting which started today in Hiroshima. The measures are set to include restrictions on various exports critical to Russia on the battlefield, as well as ones targeting entities accused of moving materials to the war front for Moscow. The G7 also reaffirmed their commitment to providing Ukraine with all the military and financial support that it needs. The move comes after the US, the UK and the EU announced a string of their own sanctions against Russian exports, including metals and diamonds. Kyiv has confirmed that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will attend the G7 summit in person on Sunday. Ahead of their first plenary session, G7 leaders gather to confront the horrors of nuclear weapons. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is hoping to convince his counterparts to back his Hiroshima action plan, which focuses on transparency around existing stockpiles and a commitment to non-proliferation. CNN's Michu Ishida with this report.
A world without nuclear weapons is an aspiration of Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, whose family comes from Hiroshima. But as he hosts the G7 summit in the nuclear-bombed city, it can't be clearer that he is swimming against the tide. The laying of wreaths at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park by G7 leaders on Friday took place against the backdrop of Russia and North Korea threatening the use of nuclear weapons. Joining Mr. Kishida at the ceremony also includes 3 nuclear-armed countries. They are the US, UK, and France. What's not shown to the media on Friday was the leaders' visit to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. That's where the images of the most devastating scenes of the 1945 atomic bombing are displayed. It's estimated that some 140,000 people died in the year when the U.S. dropped the world's first atomic bomb on the Japanese city, bringing an end to World War II. Apart from trying to create a momentum for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation as G7 host, Mr. Kishida faces the challenge of unifying member countries' positions over thorny issues such as China.
今回のサミット全体を通じての大きなテーマは分断と対立ではなく協調の国際社会の実現に向けた G7 の結束の確認と役割の強化であり、そのための積極的かつ具体的な貢献を打ち出すことです。
From Japan's perspective and under the so-called realism of diplomacy that Mr. Kishida champions, the host country is expected to urge member countries to stand firm and united against China's growing military coercion, even as they should not stop pursuing cooperation with China on other fronts. CNA spoke with Mr. Kishida's press secretary, Noriyuki Shikata, on the sidelines of the summit. He elaborated on Japan's position on the issue.
We think that there are both opportunities for engagement, and also we think that it is important to send our straightforward message in terms of concern surrounding China's activities when we find those activities not really contributing to the regional landscape.
Another feature that stands out at the Hiroshima summit is the host's efforts to reach out to countries outside G7. Mr. Kishida has brought in other countries outside of the G7 framework. They are Australia, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, South Korea, Cook Islands, Brazil, and Comoros.
Countries are suffering in the context of energy or food security issues or development finance issues. Many developing countries are suffering, from rising prices of energy and food after the pandemic, with the legacy of the pandemic still, going on. So if G7 could engage with the global South countries and make contribution to the international society, that would be probably a primary objective of this summit.
As leaders vow new sanctions on Russia, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to be in Hiroshima on Sunday for an in-person session with G7 leaders. I asked Mr. Shikata about it.
Officially speaking, at this point of time, I'm not in a position to confirm his participation, in reality. However, President Zelensky is expected to engage with the G7 leaders and the other invited guests.
According to media reports, Mr. Zelensky may arrive in Japan on Saturday evening. Michio Ishida, CNA, Hiroshima.
South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol is also in Hiroshima at the invitation of G7 host Japan. He's expected to discuss North Korea with US President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida while he's there. Back home, an activist group is urging the South Korean leader to rally international support for the release of people abducted by the isolated country. CNA's Lim Eun-suk has more.
Hwang In-chul was only 2 years old when a Korean air flight carrying 50 passengers was forced to land in North Korea instead of South Korea's Gimpo Airport in December 1969. After an international outcry, North Korea returned 39 of them, but Hwang In-chul's father, a producer for South Korea's national broadcaster MBC, was not among them. North Korea, as recently as in 2020, has claimed that the remaining 11 South Koreans on the flight, including Mr. Hwang's father, stayed in North Korea of their own free will. For more than 2 decades, Mr. Hwang has not stopped trying to bring his father back. As South Korea and Japan are on friendly terms again, with President Yoon Suk-yeol invited to the G7 meeting in Hiroshima, he urged the South Korean leader to rally international support to bring back the abductees.
그리고 G7, 저는 국제사회가 같이 함께 하는 데 있어서 함께 공감을 하면서 한 목소리로 해 나가주셨으면 상당히 너무도 감사하겠습니다. 이 문제는 사람에 관한 문제이거든요. 국제사회가 이 문제에 대해서 유엔 인권 이사회가 관심을 갖고 있는 것만큼 더 큰 관심으로 행동적으로 해 나갔으면 너무도 감사하겠습니다.
It's believed that tens of thousands of people were held captive by North Korea during the Korean War. The South Korean government estimates that hundreds of South Korean prisoners of war may still be alive in North Korea. Many families were torn apart after the end of the 3-year Korean War in 1953. Apart from those who were captured during the war, more than 500 South Koreans were abducted by North Korea even after the war ended, and they have yet to return home. Mr. Hwang says the last time he spoke to his father, who would be 86 years old this year, was in 2012. At the time, with the help of some groups, he made a failed attempt to bring him back. He's never heard from him again.
살아계시면 제가 아버지를 만날 수가 있겠고 설사 돌아가셨다 하더라도 북한에 있었던 모든 근황과 그리고 돌아가신 날짜를 알고 그리고 나는 그날 가슴 아프지만 기리면서 제사라도 지날 수 있는 그 날짜라도 알 수 있지 않고 그리고 나의 모든 상처 내가 받아왔던 모든 것들 이 아픔들을 마무리 짓지 않을까라고 생각을 해서
Lim Eun-suk, CNA, Seoul.
Well, protests have been taking place in Hiroshima as G7 leaders gather for talks. Activists took to the streets accusing some G7 countries of stoking regional tensions with Japan's neighbour China. Demonstrators said that they weren't happy that several nuclear-armed powers are meeting in the city, which was devastated by the world's first atomic bombing in 1945. Police, some in riot gear, surrounded the protesters as they marched through central Hiroshima, not far from where the G7 summit was being held.
絶対に戦争反対で原爆核使用反対です。そのために来ました。そもそもサミットの会議というのが戦争をやる核戦争をやるための の会議なので、何としても私たち労働者反対しないといけないと思ってます。
日本とアメリカが中国への侵略戦争をやろうとしている、それをここ原爆が落ちた被爆地広島で核戦争のための会議をやるようなことは僕は絶対に許さないと思って今日デモに参加しています。